Welcome to what is the 50th episode of the Rebelcast. I'm here with Athena the Bun, and we are here for your Aetherdrift Starter Kit. So, as we do in the past, we're going to go through the limited archetypes. We're going to go through the constructed themes. We're going to talk about our favorite cards, bring you some new brews, and everything in between. But first, how have you been, Athena the Bun?
I've been doing pretty well, Max. Thanks. I've just been really tired this week with everything going on. Just like trying to focus on work at this point, and focus on magic so that I can get my mind off of stuff.
You know, we were talking a little bit before the show. Absolutely the same. Yeah. Anybody who watches my streams or follows me knows that I've been late to some of those. I've been, it's been rough, but trying to get through school, trying to get through work. And I'm sure, really across this whole country, across the Magic community, everybody's probably a little bit tired and really ready for a shakeup in Standard. So we're really excited to bring you this starter kit and talk a little bit about its effect on Standard as well. But let's go ahead and jump into the limited breakdown where I'm going to go over each of the 10 new archetypes for limited. And, the relevance of these, of course, if you're playing draft, if you're playing sealed, this information will be useful. But also, the fact that this is the chance for the set to impact Standard, right? Are some of these archetypes going to synergize with things already in the meta? Are they going to revive older archetypes? Certainly that's why these sort of knowing what they are, even if you don't do draft all the time, like I don't, will be significant for constructed as well. So let's go ahead and go through each of the archetypes. I'll go over just really briefly what they focus on, what their main thing that they want to do is, and then we'll talk about the two, or I'll bring up the two uncommon signpost cards that you're going to be looking for in your draft. So first, we'll start by talking about the Azorius archetype. These are called the Guidelight Voyagers, and I want to say they're primarily an artifact control archetype, bringing lots of artifacts into play, controlling the board, making sure that you can delay the opponent until the late game where they get a lot of their payoffs. The two signpost uncommons that we're going to be looking for this is Guidelight Pathmaker. Guidelight Pathmaker is a 6-drop Vigilance vehicle, 6/5, so pretty expensive, especially if you're thinking about limited costs. But that's not uncommon. Sometimes you have to pay a lot for good limited cards. This does have Vigilance, Crew 2, which is a pretty low crew level. That's good. When it enters, you can search your library for an artifact, reveal it, put it on the battlefield if it's mana value 2 or less. Otherwise, put it in your hand, then shuffle. So this is going to help you to further the board state. You're also looking for Voyage Home, which I think this card has a little bit of relevance in constructed as well. This is a 7-drop sorcery. Not really great off the rip, right? But it does have affinity for artifacts, so it lends itself to that. And you get to draw 3 cards, gain 3 life, which I don't think is unreasonable, especially in limited, in terms of paying that cost if you're already playing in the Azorius colors. So that's Azorius. And we're going to go on to Dimir. Dimir, a little bit control-y as well, but in a different way. They are the speed demons, and this one is more of a stall control. So essentially, you're trying to fill the board, really, gum it up so that your opponent can't get through, and you're also trying to get your payoffs in the end game. So the first card, for example, that we have here is Haunt the Network. It is a 5-drop sorcery. You get to choose an opponent, create 2 1/1 Thopters, and then the chosen player loses X life. You gain X life, where X is the number of artifacts you control. So like Azorius, you want to fill up the board with artifacts, have lots of little creature artifacts.
Sorry, I was gonna say I definitely feel like it's actually kind of like more mid-rangey the control with this one. There's a lot of like these vehicles that they only have like crew 1. I know like one of the uncommon vehicles for the color too. There's also like the rare winter that seems pretty aggressively slanted.
Yes, yes. So it might have that bit of an advantage over the artifact control that is Azorius right now. So we'll see how those play out. But yeah, you are correct. This one's a little bit lower to the ground than the Azorius version. I want to say the costs are a little different. Speaking of that Crew 1 vehicle, that is the other signpost uncommon. Haunted Hell Ride is a 3-cost vehicle, a 3/3. Whenever you attack, target creature you control gets +1/+0, gets Death Touch until the end of the turn, untap it. And it is a Crew 1, which is very cheap. And I especially like it because Death Touch is one of those really valuable assets in limited. Having Death Touch creatures scales really well with your opponents that try to go bigger than you. So I very significant to point out. Thank you, Athena, that this is a little bit lower to the ground than the Azorius version. So we also have Rakdos. They are the End Riders, and Rakdos doing Rakdos things. They are going to be your max speed using the new mechanic max speed, and very aggressive. So a max speed aggro kind of archetype. We've got for our examples here, our Signpost and Comms Apocalypse Runner, which is a 4-drop 6/5 vehicle. Crew 3, so a little bit pricier. This is going to be your more mid-rangey card. You can tap it to target creature you control with power 2 or less, gets lifelink until the end of the turn, and can't be blocked. So very significant for the speed mechanic. You want to be doing damage each turn to get to max speed. And the fact that you're making something unblockable is going to help with that. Also, you're going to see across Rakdos a little bit of lifelink in addition to doing damage, gaining life, kind of drain effects. Yeah, so the other card also kind of showcasing that is 2-cost Gastel Thrillseeker, this Lizard Berserker, which may have some relevance for the Rakdos Lizards deck. Anyway, it is a 2/3. It does start your engine, so that gets you going towards the max speed mechanic. You get 1 more speed for each turn that you basically deal damage to your opponent, or your opponent loses life specifically, which is a little different than doing damage. So that's going to happen more often. When you get to max speed, there's a lot of payoffs, and in this archetype, this one in particular, you get this creature has Death Touch and Haste. So you want to, I guess you kind of want to have this maybe when you're on 3 speed and you're moving into 4, and take full advantage of that haste. Also, when it enters, deals 1 damage, you gain 1 life. And you're going to see that life swings are sort of the calling card of this archetype here.
One thing to note on that Thrill Seeker, when you're counting it for your speed, is it'll enter, start your engine, give you 1 speed, and then it'll deal 1 damage, which will give you a 2nd speed, because the once per turn limit is based on the loss of life and not just in general. You'll
That's
have 2
correct.
speed as soon as this enters.
That's really cool. Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah. Good of you to point that out. So this is really a fast archetype. Definitely goes with the go fast sort of archetype that this is. Up next, we have Gruul. They are the Goblin Rocketeers. A lot of people are probably going to go for this just for the vibes. I know I will. In some cases, if this is what I can draft, but they're going to be using the exhaust mechanic, which you get to use 1 time in the whole game, unless you can find some way to have recursion on the card or flash it back in, of course. But every one of these cards is going to have an exhaust mechanic where you get to pay, usually a lot of mana, to get some kind of boost or some game altering kind of effect. So Exhaust Midrange is the name of the game here with Gruul. Our 2 Signpost Uncommons. First one, Rocketeer Boost Buggy, is a 2-drop vehicle, a 3/2. When it attacks, you get a treasure token. So it's not an ETB. Typically, you see this be an ETB effect, but in this case, it's attack every turn, so it has to survive. It has Crew 1, very cheap, and the exhaust mechanic is 3. This vehicle becomes an artifact creature, so you no longer have to crew it, and put a 1/1 counter on it. So it kind of scales a little bit in the mid game. Our next card is Boom Scholar. This is a 3-cost Goblin Advisor creature. It is a 3/3. It says that exhaust abilities of other permanents you control cost 2 generic mana less to activate. So really making that easy, considering a lot of these exhaust mechanics are pretty expensive. This one has a 6-cost exhaust mechanic that says creatures and vehicles you control gain trample. Put 2 1/1 counters on this creature. So you can see sort of very significant effects, but they tend to be very expensive. This card, if you can get it, will help you with making those cheaper.
One thing to note with this Boom Scholar is that not only do the effects stack, if you have multiple of these, you'll get even more of a reduction on these. It's
Mm,
also, there's no limit of 1 mana on it. So a lot of these types of effects, like Training Grounds, will usually force you to at least spend 1 mana.
right.
There might be something you can do with this with your exhaust abilities. If you can get 2 of these on the board, suddenly your generic 4 mana exhausts are free.
That is crazy. Yeah, it is important to note that stacks. Wow. Yeah, okay. I can see how that could be a little bit overwhelming, especially in this archetype if you're drafting for it. So maybe Gruul is the way to go. We'll see. Let's take a look at Selesnya. Selesnya is a bit exciting because we already had Outlaws of Thunder Junction bring in, if we're talking about constructed, bring in a lot of these mounts, saddling, creatures that make saddling and mounting easier, give payoffs for it. So it's interesting that they brought this archetype in this set. They are the Alacrian Quick Beasts. So mostly, I think strictly a mount mid-range archetype. You've got the first signpost in common, Lagarin Soul of Alacria. This is a 2-cost, 1/1, pretty weak stat line there, but it does have flying. And whenever it attacks while saddled, saddle is 1, you get to put a 1/1 counter on each of up to 2 mounts or vehicles. And that's significant because you'd expect most of this, if you want to play with it just within the archetype, it would say mounts only, but a lot of these payoffs or abilities that target mounts or vehicles on the Alacrian cards, the Selesnya cards, for this archetype will say mounts or vehicles. So there's a little bit of a possibility of having synergy with a third color if you're thinking about drafting for 3. Let's see, we also have the Veteran Beast Rider. This is a 3-cost human knight, a 3/4. At the beginning of your end step, you get to untap each creature you control, and then for 4, including Selesnya colors, creatures you control get 1+1/+1 until the end of the turn. So very mid-rangey. 3/4 is a decent stat line, especially in limited, and the fact that you're essentially untapping everything, and mounts are creatures as well, and that's the advantage they have over vehicles. Is that vehicles are mostly artifacts that aren't really creatures until you crew them, whereas the mounts can sort of act on their own. So being able to untap everything on your board might give you a bit of an advantage if you're playing against a very vehicle-centric arc. Moving on, we have Orzhov. These are the champions of Amonkhet. So mechanics here, start your engines. This is a max speed grind amount sort of archetype. So it also takes advantage of the speed mechanic. And just like that, we have our first signpost in common, Embalmed Descendant. This is a 3-cost, 1/2 zombie that has start your engines. And when this creature enters, create a 2/2 zombie creature token. At max speed, it also has the added benefit of whenever a creature you control dies, you basically drain 1. Each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So you can sort of see how that tends to be the ability of this archetype that you're going to see across its cards. And you can see how that synergizes pretty well with the speed. We've also got Dune Drifter. This is a X, and then Orzhov, mana value vehicle, artifact vehicle, a 3/3. When it ETBs, return target artifact or creature card with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So you get a reanimate effect, and it is a crew 2 vehicle. So let's move on. We have Izzet colors, blue, red. And these are the keel haulers, doing a bit of cycling, giving you payoffs for cycling, and also playing aggressively with vehicles. Some of these are going to synergize, I just want to note, in constructed with the Pirates deck from Ixalan. So you might look to some of these cards in constructed to see if we can rebuild that archetype. But Boosted Sloop is going to be the first signpost uncommon. This is a 3-cost, 3/3 menace artifact vehicle. Whenever you attack, you get to draw, then discard. So, and that's one of the common mechanics here. Aside from just cycling, you have cycling on some of the cards, but you also have that. Crew 1, very low crew number. So the thing about this, though, is when you're drafting, be wary if you're going for an artifact vehicle archetype that you're still going to want to draft some low-end creatures, because if you just have vehicles out there, of course, that does you no good. So bear that in mind when you're selecting these types of archetypes. We also have Broadside Barrage, a 3-cost instant, deals 5 damage to a creature or planeswalker, then you get to draw and discard. 5 damage for 3, pretty significant and limited, I want to say. Might also see play in some very slim niche of constructed decks. We'll see, but I think for limited, this at least is sort of an efficient kill spell. All right, moving on to Golgari. This is, of course, the graveyard recursion. I mean, it's pretty much what it does almost every draft setting. But Speed Brood is the name of the team. The signpost uncommons, the first one we're looking at is Broodheart Engine, 2-cost artifact. At the beginning of your upkeep, surveil 1. And then for 4, including Golgari mana value, and tapping and sacrificing this artifact, you get to return a creature or vehicle from your graveyard to the battlefield. So a 4 cost sort of reanimate effect. Activate only as a sorcery. But yes, Broodheart Engine does what the archetype wants to do. Very clear cut kind of card. The other card, a little bit less so. It is a 6 cost, including 2 black and 2 green in the mana value. 6/5 vehicle, Thundering Broodwagon, Menace and Reach. When it ETBs, destroy a non-land permanent an opponent controls with mana value 4 or less. Crew 3, and it also has Cycle 2 on it. So at least, if you're stuck with, drought and mana, you can at least cycle this card to try to find something better.
I think it's really important for these like really big cards to impact the board as soon as they hit. In limited especially. Usually they
Yeah,
do this by like, oh, we have a 6 mana common or uncommon. It'll like gain you some life when it enters, or it'll like, tap a thing or something. This destroying something, and not just a creature, like anything is really, really strong.
it
You
really
just as
is.
long as you have the mana to cast this, you should be good.
And it scales really well. If you have to discard it
Mm-hmm.
early, you can always reanimate it later.
Mm-hmm.
Boros, we're getting to our last two. Boros, the Cloudspire Racing team. This one, very vehicular aggro sort of archetype. So it wants to throw vehicles at you. It wants to gain max speed, but it also wants to beat you very fast. And I just want to note here, and I'll also note later that I think the max speed archetype, it's yet to be seen, but it might be a bit of a win more sort of thing. So we'll see. It just seems like a snowball kind of effect. So we'll see if that hurts the Boros and Rakdos colors, since they're both kind of relying on it. But in any case, the first signpost in common, Cloudspire Coordinator, a 2 cost human pilot, a 3/1. When it enters Scry 2, you get to tap it to create X 1/1 colorless pilot creature tokens, where X is the number of mounts and/or vehicles that ETB'd this turn. The tokens have this token saddles, mounts, and crews vehicles as though its power were 2 greater. So this card's going to help you get those pilots to be able to crew and also be able to kind of gum up the board a little bit. Um, in addition to that, we have Cloudspire Sky Cycle, a 4 cost flying artifact, 2/3 vehicle. When it ETBs, distribute 2/1/1 counters among 1 or 2 other target vehicles and/or creatures you control, and crew 1, so a very low crew cost. Despite the fact it costs 4, I'd still say it's a very aggressive sort of card. Last but not least, we have Simic with the Aether Rangers. I just have to say I love that name. This one uses ramp, but also uses the exhaust mechanic in many instances. And the first signpost in common is the Aether Hive, the Ranger's Aether Hive, a 3 cost artifact vehicle, 3/5 stat line, very very nice. It does have vigilance, and whenever you activate an exhaust ability, create a 1/1 Thopter. With Crew 1 also on this, I think this is probably going to be a chase uncommon in draft settings. If you see this in the first few rounds, I think you're going to be drafting Simic. We have Sky Serpent Seeker, a 2 cost flying Death Touch snake, a 1/1. I already talked about how Death Touch is a pretty significant asset in Limited. It does have Exhaust 4, where you get to reveal from the top of your library, reveal 2 lands, put them on the battlefield tapped, and then put a 1/1 counter on this creature. So, maybe with some of those exhaust reductions, things like that, exhaust payoffs, this might be a little bit better. The Death Touch helps, the flying helps, especially if you're somehow going for max speed as well, although that does seem to lie in some of the other archetypes. So, maybe you try to find this card if you're going for a third color that takes advantage of that.
Yeah,
But
I was gonna say the Simic archetype actually looks like it works ridiculously well with the Gruul archetype. I mean, we talked again about like the card that like reduces your exhaust costs, and that really really helps with the what Simic is trying to do.
yeah, you could almost say there's a hidden teamer archetype in here as well, especially if you look at that. If you find that mythic rare loot, the version of loot for this set has like 3 exhaust mechanics, one for each of the teamer colors, and they're all just overwhelming. Like one of them is like draw 3 cards. Um, but yeah, so keep that in mind as well. It seems like I'll go ahead and tell you guys my favorite and my least favorite, and I'll add this on to the end there. My favorite is going to be Rakdos, and that's just because it's aggressive. I think the life gain and drain abilities are going to create these crazy life swings, making it really hard for your opponent to keep up. In addition to the fact that it's trying to use max speed and it gets payoffs for that, I think with the way it's playing with some of those life swings, it's going to be very easy to get to max speed. So I want to try Rakdos first and see how that goes. I was just high on some of the Simic cards. I think by itself, Simic is a little weak. I think if you do expand a teamer, you might have something there. I just don't think the ramp is fast enough. The exhaust payoffs are, good enough for how expensive they are. But that being said, regardless of whether you pick Rakdos or if you disagree with me and pick Simic, I think there's very tight margins across these 10 archetypes. I think there's a chance for each archetype to do well on any given draft. So if you build them optimally, if you have a lot of the cards, if you find most of them, I think you're going to do really well here, regardless of which one you go after.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on my least favorite also being Simic. Um, Especially like the more I thought about it, it really feels like it needs a third color with all of this to do well. Um, One thing I've kind of noticed is that it looks like uh, we're back on having the theme of like, oh, Boros and Rakdos both seem ridiculously strong in this. And
Yeah,
usually when we have those types of limited environments, it's very hard to play these like Simic low removal, kind of hope you can focus on like life gain and death touch blockers and things like that. It's really hard
yeah,
to play those types of archetypes in these sets. So, and it unlike something like Wilds of Eldraine, um, limited, it doesn't even look like it goes that high, like over the top of everything else. In Wilds of Eldraine limited, you just had like, oh, like let me get like Troyan and Beanstalk, and then I have all these like 7 mana creatures that'll just draw me cards and destroy things and gain me life. And this time around, it definitely feels like, I don't know, it definitely just feels a lot weaker comparatively. I feel like you'd have a harder time going over the top of everyone with this version of Simic.
yeah, definitely. I wanted to like it, and then I just noticed those few things. I was like, oh, it's really
Mm,
niche. It does feel like it needs a third color.
yeah,
But with that being
I
said,
definitely
what?
feel like
Go ahead.
I was gonna say I definitely feel like red looks like, at least to me, the best limited color this set. And then I'm gonna add like my favorite here as is it. Um, I've always been a huge fan of the cycling mechanic. Um, it looks super fun to play with all these like pirates, and then like unlike the Simic archetype where it feels like you need a third color to do things, the Izzet one actually looks like it's good on its own and it's good with other colors.
Yeah, absolutely. And you already said your least favorite. You kind of agree with me on the Aether Rangers, and yeah, I agree with you. Is it is another one of those that I almost picked. Also because I'm excited about that archetype for constructed and seeing if I can revive the Pirates deck just for fun. But I don't know if it'll be competitive, especially since we're still in a meta with like Sunfall and so many of those really heavy board wipes. Um, but in terms of limited, like I'd be willing to definitely try. Is it? There's some good synergy
Mm.
there. But that
Okay.
all that being said, let's go ahead and go to probably some people's favorite part of this constructed. If you're like me, you want to know how this is going to fit into the current format, how it's going to fit with other formats, and just how it does, as its own little set, outside of that context as well. So I'm going to let Athena take it away. What are some of the constructed themes here?
So one thing, I guess the first and foremost, the big thing about the set is the vehicles and the mounts, right? And whenever you have, it's much like what was it? Outlaws at Thunder Junction. If you want to brew around these sorts of things, you really have to pay attention to the crew and saddle count to find like your creatures to brew with. There's there was like this big post back when we had Bankbuster banned in standard. One of the reasons they said they did it was because the vehicle was so good it limited the creatures that you could play with it because you needed things that could crew it. Um, and there's kind of similar sentiments to vehicles in general, and then same with
Mm.
the saddle costs on mounts, where you really need to pay attention to what creatures you're putting in your deck with them. But there's a huge amount of vehicles, a huge amount of mounts to play around with, so definitely watch for those. As you look into these, you'll see that there's a lot of artifacts in the set as well. There's even a couple cards with affinity. There's cards that care about how many artifacts you have on the board. You can definitely look towards Lost Caverns, has a lot of good artifact synergies. Murders has some artifact synergies. Big Score actually had a good amount of big amount of artifact synergies. So those are definitely sets you want to look towards doing those. And then on top of that, you also want to look towards your artifact removal. Um, Go for the Throat Looks Worse if people are playing artifacts, right? Um, the cards like Abrade or Brotherhood's End suddenly look a lot better, right? Exercise starts to look better than Destroy Evil, things like that. Those are some other things to look out for.
Yeah, you mentioned Big Score, and there's a Jeskai, an Azorius, and a Boros. All three of those color sets have a potential artifact affinity deck that could be constructed, somewhere out there. So I challenge brewers to go and figure that out. Not that the Azorius artifacts deck in particular needed any help. I mean, it's already out there. At least in my estimation, at least a tier 2 potential deck. So I'm looking forward to seeing what brewers build with artifacts and artifact affinity.
Speaking of artifacts and big effects like that Jeskai deck, we have a cycle of these Gear Hulks as like a way to call back to the old Kaladesh block. These Gear Hulks are two color. Um, I believe they're all allied colors. I could be wrong about that. Um, but they're essentially these big creatures. They all have two keywords. They all have super flashy effects. One of them is like lifelink ward 1 4/4 for 4 with when it ETBs, you look at a player's hand, they discard a card of your choice and then they draw a card. That seems really good, especially against the bounce decks. Um, you have Bright Glass Gear Hulk is another, I think, 4 mana, 4/4 in Selesnya colors. It has finds you like it's a very toolboxy card. It finds you 2 1 mana, either artifacts, creatures, or enchantments, your choice. So you can kind of be really toolboxy with it. So they have these like really powerful effects to kind of play around with. So watch out for those in your 2 color decks. And then the other thing to note with this set unconstructed is they just have a bunch of these like rares and uncommons that are like really, really good build arounds for like random archetypes. There's stuff for like graveyard synergy decks. There's stuff for dinosaurs. There's stuff for like a whole bunch of random stuff. Lizards. Like it's really cool to see like they kind of splashed like a little bit of everything into this set, while keeping it kind of on theme.
Yeah, I'm honestly the biggest thing in constructed that I'm looking forward is reviving older archetypes. So we'll see how much of that happens. With I feel like they're expecting us to do that. Like there's some Easter eggs in there from sets that are about to rotate out that are going to
Mm.
synergize with those cards. So we'll look forward to stay the metas. Look forward to future Rebelcast. We'll bring those kinds of decks and synergies as we find them.
So that's pretty much it for my breakdown. I guess one more thing to note, we talked about it a little bit with the limited archetype one, but with the max speed mechanic, um, one thing you really want to look for is cards like that 2 mana Lizard Berserker, where it's a cheap card, it starts your engine, so it'll get your first one, and it like very quickly gets you the second one by itself. There's like a 1 mana 1/1 white artifact that enters, starts your engines, and then the next turn you can just swing in with your 1 mana card a lot of the time. Um, so yeah, just keep an eye out for those cards that get you 2 speed very, very fast. But other than that, next up we're going to talk about our top 5 cards for the set. When we say top 5, it doesn't specifically have to be what we think the best cards in for the set are. It could be like our favorite design. It could be impact on standard. I, for myself, did what I think just the best cards for the format's health are. Um, so I'll have that started right here. So my number 5 is going to be Ketramos, the New Dawn.
Ooh.
Ketramos is a 1 black legendary god that is a 4/4 menace, lifelink, indestructible. It can't attack or block unless there are 7 or more cards in exile. Now, whenever 1 or more cards are put into exile from graveyards and or the battlefield during your turn, you draw a card and lose 1 life. So this ends up being a really big engine. Your cards like Ghost Vacuum, Anoint with Affliction, Deadly Cover Up, your 4 mana Kaya that like exiles something from the grave every turn. These start to get super powered with this card. The other thing to note is it does avoid Nowhere to Run. It passes the Nowhere to Run check, which I think is on the format right now. Um, it's your 3 mana creature. It's a 4/4, so it won't die to that. Even though it does suck a little bit against the bounce stuff, and it does kind of get BFO'd by Anoint with Affliction. So you do have to watch out for those cards getting more popular if this starts to see more play.
Absolutely, and it's important to note this mechanic about exile, where it can attack or block. That's total cards in exile, so it's not just your cards in exile; it's your opponents as well. So if you're also playing white, you're also playing like lay down arms and exile based removal, that kind of thing.
Number 4, I have Dredger's Insight. 1 green for an enchantment. Whenever one or more artifact and or creature cards leave your graveyard, you gain 1 life. And then when this enchantment enters, mill 4 cards. You may put an artifact, creature, or land from among the milled cards into your hand. So note it says milled cards, not from cards in your graveyard. So this will work through a rest in peace effect.
Yeah.
Um, that was the first thing I kind of noticed. It works much like Picklock Prankster or what is it, Cash Grab, where
Mm-hmm.
they can
Mm-hmm.
get the card right away, even through a rest in peace, and they may even help you find the thing that answers it. Um, you guys know me. This just screams Insidious Roots,
Oh
right?
yeah. Oh yeah.
Um, one or more creatures leave your graveyard, you gain a life. Really helping shore up stuff against aggro, and it is just a really good enabler in general. We're currently sitting at you can run 12 2 mana enablers for these graveyard decks in Golgari colors between Cash Grab, Overlord, and Dredger's Insight, and you get to kind of pick and choose which ones you feel like you need more based on what they offer for you. But this card looks great for graveyard decks, and I cannot wait to play around this.
Yeah, that's awesome. This might be what Insidious Roots needs to reach like a tier status, because I already thought the deck was good. I don't think enough people are on it. So yeah, wow. Okay, I'll look forward to seeing that in Roots decks.
Number 3, I have Oil Deep Gear Hulk. It's blue, blue, black, black for a 4/4 artifact creature with lifelink and ward 1. When this creature enters, look at target player's hand. Now it says look, not reveal. You may choose a card from it. If you do, that player discards that card, then draws a card. So if you are empty-handed, right, you can look at your opponent's hand, look at their hand, find the best card, pluck it out, and then they draw a card. If you are in a situation where maybe you want to discard something, you don't actually have to reveal your hand to your opponent. You just look at your own hand, discard a card, draw a card. Um, Card plays very well against the bounce stacks. Doesn't die to Nowhere to Run. Has ward. I mean, it has the ward 1, which will probably get canceled out by the Nowhere to Run, but a lot of cases it won't. Um, then on top of that, it just being this creature that has a good ETB means that even if they do bounce it over and over, you're still getting value for it.
Yeah, we're gonna have to keep looking for cards that get around bounce, and that's significant, right? We're still, I think, in my selections and in yours, there's still some cards that kind of lose a little bit to bounce here or there, but I still included the ones that I selected anyway because yeah, I'm still trying to look beyond the current meta and hope that there's some other things that come in rock paper scissors style and scare those decks away. So we'll see. We'll note when things get around bounce, but it's not the only concern we have when we're selecting these.
My number 2 is Bloodghast. Probably needs no introduction, but just in case, it's a black black creature vampire spirit. It's a 2/1 that cannot block. It has haste as long as an opponent has 10 or less life. And it has whenever a land you control enters, you may return this card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So historically really good in graveyard, very fast graveyard decks, good in black aggro decks. Something to look forward to is we actually have a lot of these like very strong low mana recursive black creatures now. There's another one in the set called Gas Guzzler. There's Bloodghast. There's Forsaken Miner. There's Razor Lash Transmogrant. There's actually a lot of things that a black deck can do. Unstoppable Slasher.
Yep.
Um, that can help you make like an aggro deck that's really resilient to removal. Um, so that's like one thing to look out for. Also, another card that just works ridiculously well with Roots. Everyone knows I love Roots. Um, and it's definitely a card that like it needs a home. Like it needs to have a specific deck to build around. You can't just like throw this in Golgari mid range and call it a day. But it's definitely a really powerful card if it has the right shell.
Yep, I agree. Bloodgast. I'm thinking also about just like the reanimator decks as well. But I see what your next one is. Please, I can't wait to hear you talk about this.
So number one on my list is unfortunately Spell Pierce. And normally I would be very, very excited about Spell Pierce being in the format. I guess let me get into the card in case anyone hasn't seen it before, like a newer player or something. It's blue instant. Counter target non-creature spell unless its controller pays 2 generic mana. So it's a 1 mana counter for that trades up in mana pretty much every time. It's very good for blue aggressive decks, and if we look at the current format, the two most played decks are both blue aggressive decks that bounce a lot of things. So uh, Spell Pierce definitely looks like it just slots right into both Esper and Dimir bounce decks. Um, it could be a sideboard card if you want to play something like Azorius Artifacts. It could be for like your Dimir aggro deck that's still also like a tiered deck with like Masterminds and stuff. So definitely a very scary card to have in standard right now. I normally love having it in standard, but with these like aggressive blue decks already at the top, it just kind of scares me.
Yeah, I agree. We did give those decks a blue another tool. Yeah, we'll see how this shakes things up if it does at all. I was before this last foundation set. I was looking forward to the possibility of something like Spell Pierce to kind of break up the mid range suit, but I don't know. Yeah, I'm with you on that one. I don't know. I'm scared to see what it does.
Mm. But Max, you go on and tell me what your top five cards are for the set.
So, no particular order here, other than I have my biases. I like to play Convoked. I like to play green decks. I like to play go big stuff that loses to the board wipes. But nonetheless, I think there are some tools for some decks already in the meta, so I'm going to point those out here. No particular order of importance, just five that I like. The first one I'm going to talk about is Voyager Glidecar. This is a 1 white mana artifact vehicle, 2/3 for a 1 drop. When it enters, you get to scry one. You get to tap 3 other untapped creatures you control, and until the end of the turn, it becomes a creature, an artifact creature, gains flying, and you get to put a 1/1 on it. Crew 1. So I think this slots into Convoke. It is a 1 drop artifact, if nothing else, but it's also a very aggressive creature. So I think also slots into token decks that are going to be able to pump out those 3 1/1 tokens very relatively quickly and turn this on. But it also has crew 1, so you can crew it as a 2/3 right off the rip anyway. So I think 1 mana value cards are sort of overlooked. Power Creep is showing us, what to expect at 1 mana value. I always bring up the example of Savannah Lion. It was just a 2/1, and because it was a 2/1 for one, people used to go crazy over that card way back in the day in Magic the Gathering. So I usually use that as a baseline to compare, what are the 1 drops in the set doing now, and this is an example of a very aggressive. Up next, I have a Verge. We are getting Sunbillow Verge, which is going to be the Boros Verge. Add a white mana or add a red mana if you have a mountain or plains. And the fact that it's add a white is very significant, I think, for the Convoke archetype, both Jeskai and Boros flavors, but more for the Jeskai side because I feel like the mana base is tough for those 3 colors even still. But Sunbillow Verge should make that mana base just easy enough that the deck might be able to get back into the top 2 tiers. We will see. But I am excited about Sunbillow Verge.
Yeah, I think it's always important when you're looking at these lands to see which color it gives you first, as that'll really determine what types of decks you can play in those colors. For this one, having white first is amazing for like if you want to play like Boros Caretakers or if you want to play like the Convoke deck. Then it's gonna look a little bit worse if you want to play something like Mice.
Yeah. Yeah, because Mice is primarily a red color deck, but those other ones you listed are primarily white. So yeah, I think that's very significant. We have up next. This is probably going to be my favorite. I put it at 3. I should have probably put it at 1, but I said no particular order. This is Regal Imperiosaur. Me and Figured Base and Rictus saw this card and we're like, hey, let's play dinos for the next week in anticipation of this. I didn't do so hot with it, but I think this card could help the deck significantly. It is, it has the Anthem effect built in. 3 mana. It does require 2 green, which is, if it was just 1 green, if you're putting it in Gruul Dinos, that does, I don't know, that makes it a little tough. But with Llanowar Elves in the format, I think it's still easy to pay for. And, pretty much guarantee on turn 3. It is Anthem effect for Dinos, +1/+1, and the stat line is a 5/4. If you're playing with the 2-drop Yearling, that means your Yearling becomes a 5-power creature. You already had Hammer Skull in this slot. I think this is better than Hammer Skull. I think you slot this in instead of the Hammer Skull. Some people are saying slot this in instead of the Yearling, since that seems to be an underwhelming card. We shall see. But nonetheless, I think this Anthem effect is going to help the deck significantly. And, will it be a deck again? We shall see in the first couple weeks. And we're definitely going to post a brew on it, at least in Stay the Meta for the first week. I'll make sure of it.
One thing to note is this now gives dinosaur decks 8 1-mana mana dorks between I don't remember the name of the dinosaur specific one, but there's that one in Llanowar Elves. And then it also gives 8 powerful 3-drops between the Hammer Skull and this. So having 8 of an effect is usually a really good thing if it's for the sake of consistency. So being able to consistently go elf into 3-drop in this deck is going to be really, really good. If you need proof, just look at Mono Green Devotion and Pioneer.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Mono Green Devotion and Pioneer. And that's proof of this ability, this effect on the meta. We'll see. I do think the deck was missing powerful 3-drops that did something significant, for the whole Kindred type. Also, the fact that, most people were trying to ramp into like Vaultborn Tyrant or like the 6-drop, 7-drop dinos, and that's a little tougher. Now that's going to be a little bit easier to do, and you're not expected to really do that to win because you've got powerful 3-drops in the format. My next card is Webstrike Elite. I love the versatility on this card. This is a 2-drop Insect Archer. It's a 3/3 with Reach, which I think for 2 is a really good stat line, especially considering you've still got Kaido decks out there. They're trying to sneak in with the Spyglass Siren. So a lot of flyers, a lot of low-end flyers. This will help significantly. I think it scales well as well. You have cycling on it if you're in the late game and this is kind of useless. When you cycle this card, though, you get to destroy an artifact or enchantment with mana value X, according to what you pay when you cycle. So in the late game, you want to get rid of a problematic artifact or enchantment. Lots of artifacts coming to the format. We already have lots of enchantments, so the versatility of this card, I think, makes it stand out just a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's important to note how good this card is against the bounce stacks. Obviously, does die to nowhere to run, but it's even on mana when it does that.
Yeah.
And if you are scared of nowhere to run, you can actually just kill one of their enchantments, including their Fear of Isolation, for about 4 mana. So, and you'll draw a card out of it. So, I definitely think this is something to look out for. Some people have liked playing things like Selesnya Cage into the bounce stacks, and this might be something you can slot into there to help that matchup even more.
Yeah, at the very least, a decent sideboard card for many decks that are playing green. Yeah. So, last card that I selected, and this is because I've been playing Rakdos Reanimator a lot lately, so I had this in mind, is Crypt Caller Chariot. This is a 4-cost vehicle, 5/5 with Menace, so great stat line. Crew 2, but whenever you discard one or more cards, you get to create that many tapped 2/2 black zombie creature tokens. So I think if you're in the mid game, you're not finding your Zombify, you're not finding your Cruelty of Gix, I think this is a great way to dump, find what you need. But in addition, if you have Bitter Reunion, if you have the Treasure Vault out there, when you're dumping, get to fill up the board with 2/2 zombies, and they can block. In the past, zombie tokens have not been able to block. These can block. So I think that's very significant for gumming up the board and being able to keep off the pressure until you can find your zombify or what have you. So I think this might have just filled a slot that the deck needed. In addition to having just zombify in the 4-drop slot, there's something else you can slot in there in case you don't find that card. You can kind of stall your opponent on the way to being able to do that. So none of these are high impact except for maybe the Imperiosaur, but they're all subtle things that I think these tier 2.5 decks really needed to kind of find their way. And I'm not saying that this is going to be sufficient for the Reanimator deck to really place or anything like that, but I do think that this, along with maybe one or two other tools from the set, could make them relevant again. So we shall see. Those are my top 5.
One thing to note with that Color Chariot card, you can actually use it as a sideboard pivot. So it's the same mana cost as your Zombify. So if you're playing against a deck that has like a bunch of Rest in Peace or Ghost Vacuums or something, this is a very easy swap 4 in 4 out for your Zombify. I think it gets even better if you go to like Dimir colors because Dimir Reanimator tends to have all those like draw 2, discard 2s through like Steam Core and Kiora and things. So definitely a card to look out for. It is a really, really strong engine if you have like a lot of discard stuff. You just need to find actually good discard cards to play with this.
Yeah, and if you somehow find your way in Orzhov Reanimator in those colors, it kind of syncs up with Ketramos a little bit as well. Um, those if you're talking about the sideboard B plan, if you're having to sideboard those cards in against an exile based plan or a Rest in Peace, I think it works for that as well. So interesting. We'll see. We'll see what way Reanimator goes. It's been Rakdos. It's been Dimir. I have seen a few like Sultai variants, Jund variants. I know Mother of Halflings is talking about Jund. We're constantly in the background trying to build that deck up and see what the best colors are for Reanimator. So I really look forward to what this format introduces overall for Standard. I think it's Foundations. A lot of the criticisms were that it was a bit underwhelming in terms of changing the format up. I think similarly, it's going to take a minute for Aetherdrift to shift things. But we do get a few little pieces that I think brewers will be able to tap into and be creative with. So that's a huge plus.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think a lot of the commons and uncommons are actually really cool in this set too. Not just the rares and mythics, which are what you usually look for to brew.
Yeah.
Yeah, so just something to look out for.
All right. So let's go ahead and talk about our last segment here, and probably another one that people really look forward to. What decks can you play week 1 to try and test the meta, test the format? Maybe we'll have something placed in the top 8 this upcoming, the first week of Aetherdrift. What are some contenders? We'll first look at 2 decks from Athena, and then I'll present 2 other decks. So, Athena, what do you have for us?
So the first deck that I have here is going to be Teamer Cauldron. So there was an Izzet / Jeskai Cauldron deck that had come up every one style a couple of months ago, where it was using Arcanus the Omnipotent plus Agatha's Soul Cauldron as like a value engine. For me, Loot is just a better version of that. I think Loot is a pretty bad card in general, but if you put it under a Cauldron, it looks amazing.
Yep.
You can tap one creature for 3 mana. You can tap one creature for draw 3 cards, one creature for 3 damage to any target. And obviously, it's only because they're exhaust abilities, you're only going to be able to do it once per creature. But having it under a Cauldron means that every single creature you play starts to get this effect. And what else are we doing with this, right? So we're dumping it into the graveyard using Fear of Missing Out, using Dredger's Insight, that new green card I talked about that seems really good for graveyard decks. We're using Kiora, we're using Steam Core Scholar. A lot of these cards that will get it into the graveyard pretty quick, and most of them draw a card. So because of all the card draw, this deck plays Profts. Another way to, one, just give you some damage output while you're doing all that on these creatures that are kind of bad on their own sometimes. But then it also gives you the counters for your Soul Cauldron. So you can kind of go crazy with this deck just from seeing a couple things when I was doing like basic playtesting. The other thing to note is I needed a way to make this deck resilient against bounce because unfortunately, if you this town the Agatha's Soul Cauldron after you exile loot, um, the whole deck just falls apart.
Hmm.
So diversion unit is actually pretty much that because it'll be 1 mana to sacrifice whatever creature you want and then counter this town unless they pay 3. And obviously you can repeat that. If you have 3 creatures on the board, you can sack 3, make them pay 9, right? If we get to ridiculously late game into the game. So it's kind of like a mid-range grind deck. There's definitely ways to play this more combo-y. You can play like what is it, Krenko, the 4 mana one that like makes a bunch of goblins when you tap it. Um, there's a bunch of different ways to try this deck out, but this is where I'm starting with it.
And the new Verges, I think, also enable the Teamer archetype. I think they had Teamer in mind for constructed and limited as well, with the River Pyre and Willow Rush Verge. Yeah, those are significant for these colors, especially since they go blue. Well, this one goes red primarily, and this one goes blue primarily. Okay, yeah, okay, cool.
Yeah, you definitely want to look out for when you're playing 3 colors. Now that we do have all the
Yeah,
verges, each of your 3 color combos will have 2 verges that start on one specific color when you're playing a wedge like this. So 2 of my 3 verges start on red. So I play torches and FOMOs and things like that to take advantage of that early game.
okay, very cool. Thank you for that note. Yeah, you keep that in mind. Mana based building is not something that comes natural to all Magic players. It's definitely something you become comfortable with over time. And I'm just now learning how to build mana bases correctly, with the help of the Rebellion, of course. But what other deck do you have for us?
So the other deck I have is Dimir Artifacts. So one thing that you had mentioned earlier was that we have these big score cards that really care about artifacts, and especially with these Azorius artifacts that have popped up from time to time because of them. Well, now I think we actually have enough tools that we can go Dimir instead of Azorius. One of the big downsides of the Azorius artifacts deck was that it was pretty slow to start up and died to aggro. Playing black instead of white will actually give you way better removal. You're comparing Get Lost to Go for the Throat here. It's not even close. Um, when dealing with an aggro deck. So this was what I kind of brewed up with it. It's still got your Simulacrum Synthesizer. It's still got your Braided Net. But now and it's still got your Thran Spider, which notably is a very good card against the bounce decks.
Ooh.
Um, yeah, so because your 3 mana 2/4 reach will not die to their nowhere to run, and if they bounce it, you just replay it, and it'll block their flyers forever.
Hell yeah. Okay.
Um,
Thank you for pointing that
yeah,
out. I forgot all about Three and Spider.
yeah. And then the other thing with this is because of the new black cards here. I guess I'll just go over both of them. The first one's the Oil Deep Gear Hulk, which is the one that I had talked about earlier. Um, just a really solid threat, able to like help you get through your hand with if it's really clunked up with bad spells. It can discard key things from your opponent. There's gonna be 1 point in your life that you're gonna discard your opponent's Brotherhood's End, and you're gonna be the happiest person in the world. And then the other card that really helps this, I think, is Demonic Junker. So it's a 7 mana 4/3 vehicle with affinity for artifacts. When it enters, for each player, destroy up to 1 target creature that player controls. If a creature you controlled is destroyed this way, you put 2 counters on this vehicle, and it is Crew 2. So, notably, Crew 2 works with Thran Spider. You end up getting a lot of random creatures with your Simulacrum Synthesizer, and you're just gonna end up having a lot of artifacts in play to make this really cheap while triggering your Synthesizer. So super excited to play this. I've got like 9, 10, 11 removal spells in my main board, some more in my sideboard, negates, jaces for the long game, etc. So this will probably be the first deck that I really try to mess around with on the new set.
All right, very cool. I know you were already on Demir control. It's interesting to see Demir also have a slightly more aggressive archetype in it as well. And yeah, I think you're right. I think I listed Azorius, Jeskai, Boros, but Demir artifacts, the way that you put it here, I think it could also be a contender. So I'm interested to see the results with that one. Um, But let's go ahead and go to my two decks that I'm presenting today. First off, we have an archetype that I've been interested in for quite some time, but just has not been viable. And we're going to see with these new tools if it becomes viable. Selesnya Counters. So let's talk about the new cards. You already know about Tumblewag. You already know about Paw Patch Recruit and what it's doing in the current format, standard format, especially against the bounce decks, the single target removal decks. But introduced into the one mana value slot, we have District Mascot, and I want to say my notes here that it's replacing Evolving Adaptive. Evolving Adaptive for me personally was always that go-to one mana value card for counters, whether it was green or Selesnya, where it just gets bigger over time. This card also gets bigger over time, but in a different way. It actually asks for you to attack into the opponent and be more aggressive. Whenever it attacks while saddled, you get to put a 1/1 counter on it. It's a one saddle mount. But significantly enough, especially because we're going to have lots of artifacts in the format, it also, scales really well. You can remove two 1/1 counters from it, assuming that it's already built up some, from over the course of attacking, and destroy target artifact. So it has that ability as well. That's going to be significant for the format, I think. So interesting card to point out. I also, we have Land and War Elves in the format. We can go up to the 3 mana value slot significantly. We already have Enduring Innocence. We already have Tumblewag doing work. So considering that, we have also Bulwark Ox, which works with both of those. But Bulwark Ox is one of those ways that this deck can sort of provide itself some board wipe protection, so to speak. It's not going to protect against Sunfall, but it is going to protect against a significant number of board wipes in the format currently. In the sideboard, many people forget about this card, but while people are running Balos, this deck has the Wiltleaf Liege. I try to point out this card whenever I can, but this has a very similar, if you're forced to discard it, you bring it in, but it also provides a really great Anthem effect for green and white, and that's really significant in a format where you have to get them dead pretty fast. This is going to speed up your clock. Also in the sideboard, 2 copies of the new Planeswalker-esque kind of card, I want to say, the Aether Spark. And it has a wall of text on it, but to simplify it, this is essentially a card that can act as an engine for your creatures, really giving them extra benefits for attacking aggressively. And so, in addition to your 1-drop District Mascot, this deck is going to push for you to be much more aggressive rather than sit back and collect 1/1 counters, sort of like what Mono Green wants to do. This deck wants you to be aggressive. 4 Sheltered by Ghosts, for game 1. I know that card can be a liability, but when you're going aggressive, when you're curving out at 3, I think Sheltered by Ghosts is very appropriate. So an aggressive version of Selesnya counters, I think the deck needs to be low curve for it to survive at all.
Yeah, I actually really like the inclusion of Aether Spark here instead of something like usually you'd have like Elspeth in that spot probably.
Yeah.
Just because this thing gets out of control super fast. If you have a brawler with like 4 counters on it already, you put this on it, it gets like 2 more counters, you swing in, this gets like 10 loyalty. You can start to get really insane with all these creatures that just go out of control really fast.
Yeah, and Selesnya colors, I would love for that to be the colors that are as aggressive as Gruul is now. Like, people look to Gruul mono red to be that aggressive and that fast. If Selesnya can get that fast, I think it could get out of hand really quick. But the other deck, we're talking a lot about artifacts in this format, in this set. I think artifacts are coming back in multiple colors. I have Azorius artifacts for you. Azorius artifacts, it had been a thing with the synthesizer, but I think a lot more recently, folks started to look towards Zoetic Glyph and building a more aggressive Azorius that was more low curve. And I think that's where Azorius Artifact's future lies. So if we take the basic shell, like Convoke, where you have the 1-drop creatures that bring in an artifact, and then you have Warden of the Inner Sky, I think that's a good shell. I don't think you get away from that. So I like that. I think you add to that the new card Spell Pierce coming back to the format, and you also add the Nesting Bot, which we've already talked about. That card has the potential to be very aggressive, and when it dies, it gives you another artifact, so it kind of replaces itself. I also love Diversion Unit, which Athena's already brought up, really allows you to extend your ability to go into the mid game with your aggressive game plan. Stalling your opponent's board wipe, stalling your opponent's removal spell. I think that's going to be very significant for this archetype. Any aggressive archetype would benefit from that, and this one definitely does. The cool new legendary rare for this deck, I want to point out Mendicant Core Guidelight. This thing is awesome. So it gets as big as the number of artifacts that you have on the field. It has start your engines. It has a max speed payoff. And with this deck being, having evasive creatures, low curve, attacking almost every turn, you're going to get to max speed. But the payoff is that you can copy artifacts when you cast them by paying 1, and that is significant. Imagine bringing in 2 Steel Seraphs very cheaply. You get a good value out of some play like that. But the other new card for this deck is Voyage Home, which is the affinity for artifacts sorcery that allows you to draw 3, gain 3 life. So the gaining 3 life, you might scoff at that, but that is significant in a format with a lot of aggressive decks. Being able to draw 3 cards on the cheap, I mean, you're potentially by, this is a 7 cost card, but I think potentially by turn 3, you're going to have enough artifacts to be able to cast this, and on turn 3, that's actually a really good play. The sideboard, everybody knows how to build a sideboard for Azorius by now, and not much changes except for the fact that we have Spell Pierce in the format, and that's nothing to scoff at. When you're playing a low curve aggressive deck, being able to stall that board wipe for 1 to 2 more turns is quite significant. You can usually get them dead by then. So we'll see. We'll see if Azorius Artifacts has a future as well. I think overall this is probably the deck I'm going to try week 1. I've already been playing a different sort of aggressive Azorius Artifacts deck that's more creature centric, but this looks very appealing to me, and this is definitely something I want to try.
Yeah, I really like the inclusion of Voyage Home here, kind of replacing Enduring Curiosity. We've seen people kind of go away from Curiosity in general, just because of the fact that if you pay 4 and then it gets bounced for 2, it looks really bad. It dies to
Yeah,
nowhere to run. Um, so Voyage Home kind of gets around that, right? It's not like you can just remove a Voyage Home. And yeah, I think casting this on turn 4 is like gonna be the norm. And 4
yeah,
mana, draw 3, gain 3 looks absolutely amazing into the bounce stacks.
absolutely, absolutely. I'm really looking forward to trying it. But those are our 4 new brews for you for Aetherdrift. I think the set's going to benefit from artifacts. It's going to benefit from some of these small, more nuanced cards that are low curve, and look to build low curve aggressive decks because I think that's the future of the format. We've been seeing bounce, some of these ETBs, some of these extra exhaust effects. Maybe we'll be able to get around bounce a little bit, dominating the meta. We shall see. That'll be the big question week 1 is what's the percentage of bounce decks still out there? I think it'll still be high, but are they going to have the same conversion rate at events? That's going to be the significant question for me. What about you, Athena? What do you think we should look for week 1?
Just things that beat bounce. I mean, right
Yeah,
now, bounce is something like 50%. Oh, it's getting close to like 50% of the meta game between the 2 different variants. You really need a deck that's just going to have strong ETBs, which I think these Gearhulks really do a good job at doing. Um, and you want to have things with like 4 toughness. So those are going to be your 2 big things to look at is like 4 toughness, big ETBs, etc. And then at the same time, you also have to try to find a way to survive against Gruul, right? So
yeah,
third best stack out after those 2 is Gruul aggro. And if you're not playing a good enough sideboard plan against an aggro deck, you're just going to get run over. So that would be my advice. 4 toughness, ETBs, anti-aggro stuff.
all right, and that's really all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us.
Of course, and this episode of the Rebelcast is sponsor free. So, if you'd like to contribute to what we do and make sure we stay in the game as long as possible, consider making a purchase in our merch store or joining the Rebellion.
All right, and until next time, untap, upkeep, resist.
Resist.